Welcome back, everybody. Today we are talking about Civil War records, and we're talking with Brian Rhinehart. He is an expert and a professional genealogist. He makes a living looking up Civil War records at the National Archives. Now, most of these records he looks up at the National Archives are on the Union side, but we're going to kind of talk about, as you are doing your research, how you can go about figuring out if that's your guy or not, that kind of thing. And so you can find Brian at civilwarrecords.com. Welcome, Brian. I'm so glad you're back.
Thank you, Connie. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation to come back.
So for those of you watching at home, we had recorded an episode 2 years ago, and it was so good. And so what I did was I pulled some of that information out of that episode, and I'm going to ask Brian some of those questions again, because he really had some great tips. So let's get started with, what kind of records are you going to find at the National Archives versus the state archives?
The National Archives versus the state archives is going to depend on which side of the war your soldier was in. The National Archives has all the Union records.
Okay.
The state archives, the individual state archives, is where you're going to find the Confederate records. So if you have a Confederate soldier who's from Alabama, you probably don't need to go to Washington, D.C. to find their records. They're probably going to be in Alabama.
Okay. So in your experience working with the National Archives, what's the biggest misconception you think people have about Civil War records?
Oh, that's a good question. One misconception is that I think of a couple. One of them being that everything is online. The reality is the vast majority of these records are not online. There are a lot of indexes for these records that are online. That could be what's throwing you off. The other misconception would be that every soldier received a Civil War pension later in life. Most of them did. The reality is that some didn't for various reasons. So your soldier might not be in the Civil War pension index because they just didn't receive a pension.
So if someone's just getting started with Civil War records, what kind of questions should they be asking themselves?
Well, first, I would ask myself, I wonder what kind of records even exist for my soldier. Did he receive a pension? Are there going to be service records? Was he injured or even killed during the war? Because that could change the type of records that might be available.
I think from the previous episode, one of the tips that, I don't know why I didn't think of this. You just constantly came up with great tips. And so I'll link that in the description if somebody wants to watch that previous episode. But one of the things you said was, before we even decide whether we have a Civil War soldier or not, let's think about, was he eligible? What age was he? What years should he have been born? And I don't know why I didn't even think about that. But, I think that alone was probably one of the factors that I was like, oh,
again,
duh, I should have figured that one out.
Yeah, that sweet spot is sort of in the 1830s, 1840s for a birth range. There were younger soldiers. There were older soldiers. I recently, in my own family tree, uncovered a Civil War ancestor, direct ancestor, who was born in 1803, which would have made him 60 years old during the war, which is incredibly unusual, but he was there. If you've got a 60-year-old, I wouldn't count on him being in the war, but apparently you can't rule it out.
Interesting. So in the other episode as well, you had talked about indirect evidence and direct evidence, and like indirect evidence as a kind of a breadcrumb trail.
Yeah.
What's the most overlooked clue you think people maybe miss in their own family tree that maybe could point to a Civil War?
There's one that could be hiding in plain sight, and that could be if you're looking at the children in the family and there's a gap where that corresponds with the Civil War years. If dad is off at the war, mom's not having babies. And so if you have a gap, they have children in 1857, 1859, 1861, then they pick up again in 1866. I wonder if dad was off at the Civil War. There could be other explanations for it, but that is definitely a clue that could be staring you right in the face and you might not even know it.
I know that one of the things you said was, if someone disappears between 1860 and 1870 census, that might be an indication that maybe they died during the war.
Yeah.
How do you avoid jumping to the wrong conclusion there?
Well, at that point, if that's all you have, it's only a theory. And so to avoid jumping to that wrong conclusion, be open-minded that there could be other possibilities. You may need
Yeah.
to look at the actual records for the Civil War to see if he shows up in there. And if he does, did he die? So don't draw your conclusions too early. It's a clue, but it's not definitely the right answer.
So let's talk about direct evidence for a minute. And for those who may not know what we're talking about when we're talking about direct and indirect, direct evidence directly answers the research question. Was this soldier my guy? Or indirect evidence might have to piece a couple things together to get the answer to our question. So in the previous episode, you had emphasized asking family members first.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find all those oral histories usually to be accurate, or do they need some heavy verification?
Some of both. You're probably familiar with family stories. I think everybody's got them. There's usually some kernel of truth, but it's rarely 100% accurate. The stories get embellished over time. I asked my grandmother when I first started doing this, and she told me that her great-grandfather was in the Civil War. She called him by the wrong name, but she was correct. Her great-grandfather was in the war, but she referred to one of her great uncles instead. So, I mean, I was looking for the wrong person. Then I pieced it together and like, oh, it's this guy, not this guy.
Gotcha.
So yeah, there are some truths to those family stories, but don't take them as, gospel truth.
So we know that the 1890 federal census was burned, but the veteran schedule, a good portion of it, has survived, which I know is a good record set. I think it's probably a gold mine for, helping to find your ancestry, but not all the states survived. So how do you work around those missing states from the 1890?
Well, let's first talk about which states do exist. That's alphabetically Kentucky through the end of the alphabet. Those 1890 veteran census, those records still exist.
Okay.
It was supposed to be just for Union soldiers. A couple of those Confederates slipped in there, but for the most part, it's just going to be Union soldiers or their widows listed. How do you get around it if you're in Illinois or Delaware or something and those don't exist? There are other records that he could still be in. There's the 1910 federal census that directly asked, were you in the Civil War? I never knew that was there for a long time. The very end of the column asked, were you in the Civil War? So you could look on there. Check to see the Civil War pension index. Did he receive a pension? Is he in that index? Things like that still exist. It's just the 1890 census makes it easy to find them. So without that, you have to do a little more work.
I wonder why so many people overlook the 1910 census when they're thinking about, their ancestors and whether, I think a lot of times people just don't read all the way to the right, and it's one of those right-hand columns.
Yep.
Now I think it's that census that has some abbreviations, UACA.
Yeah.
Can you explain what those are?
Yes. So you have to be careful when you're looking at that particular census record. It's the third to the last column on the 1910 federal census. We were asked, were you in the Civil War? The abbreviations, like you said, UA, UN, CA, or CN, for Union Army, Union Navy, Confederate Army, Confederate Navy. If those initials are there, you're probably looking at a Civil War soldier. They use that column, the tabulator, for some kind of notation. They would put random numbers in there sometimes. So the number 7 doesn't mean that he was in the Civil War. The tabulator used that. I don't know all the reason why, but that could throw people off too.
Yeah, they probably should have put a column in there for internal use only or office use only so they could have a place to write, because I think
you're right.
you see that on other censuses.
That'd be too easy,
well.
though.
Yeah, and for those at home, if you are getting any value out of this, I would appreciate it if you hit the like button and or subscribe to the channel. I'd appreciate it. But hey, let's talk about common names. So we have, I know both of us, we've talked about this in the past, have had Civil War soldiers with multiple. William Smith, I think, was the one that you had talked about.
Yeah.
What's your strategy for dealing with someone with common names? Like you might find multiple records.
Yeah, there are definitely some things that could help. In my own family tree, my 4 grandparents, one of them was a Miller, one of them was a Wilson. So I have some experience digging through some of these common names. For Civil War soldiers, there's a lot of resources that could help. The key piece of information is if you have the name of the regiment, such as the 17th Ohio Infantry. If you know that, we know exactly where to look at the National Archives for those records. If all you're telling me is his name is Thomas Davis from Pennsylvania, I don't know if we can help you with that until we can narrow it down a little bit more. There are resources such as that 1890 veteran census. If you know exactly which town and county he lived in, go look in that particular town, see if he's listed. They were supposed to give a regiment number in that list. That's all you need. The Civil War Pension Index has a listing of every soldier. I have some tips that can show you how to work through those pension indexes to find your right soldier with a common name. Look at obituaries, gravestones. A lot of times, Civil War soldiers were very proud of their service. After they were gone, the family knew that, and they would include that in the obituary and even on the gravestone sometimes.
Yes, I've seen it on the gravestones.
Yeah.
Sometimes you had to figure out what OVA or something meant, but, Ohio, something.
OVI, Ohio
Yeah.
Volunteer Infantry.
There
Yeah,
you go.
there you go.
Let's talk about the National Park Database. You'd mentioned this in the last episode, and, it was not really even on my radar because it's not something I do on a regular basis. So is this a starting point maybe for people who are trying to figure this out, find their Civil War
Yeah.
soldier?
And I think you used the right phrase when you said starting point. It is a good starting point, but it is not the ending point because it's the National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors Database. It's got a listing of every soldier on both sides, Union and Confederate. It's got their
Okay.
name and their regiment. But just because you find your soldier in there does not mean that you're looking at the right soldier. It could be someone that has the same name. Even if it's a fairly unusual name, you still need to double check in the actual records to know, is this your soldier? But it's a good starting point. If you find someone listed in there with your soldier's name, make a note of the regiment, start doing some other research to see, do any of their other records correspond with my ancestor in that regiment?
Okay, so if you do find somebody, how do we move to the next step? What would be that? Fold 3 or Ancestry?
It would be some of the records that we just talked about. You can verify that in the 1890 veteran census. You can verify that in the 1910 census. Sites like Fold 3 and Ancestry definitely are a good starting point too. There's a lot of these Civil War pensions that are indexed on both of those sites. You can check on there. Is he in the pension index? We talked about obituaries. Check for that. See if your ancestor has that same regiment mentioned in his obituary.
Good point. How common is it that maybe somebody is listed twice, like same name, multiple soldiers by the same name, maybe even in the same regiment? How common is that?
Do you mean different people with the same name or the same
Yes.
man showing up more than once or both?
Yeah, 2 Will Smiths.
Well, I think the answer on that is obvious. If you've got 2, you probably have more than 2 Will Smiths. I'd be surprised if you have only 2 William Smiths. There were, I don't know the exact number, a couple million soldiers in the Civil War. This was not just a small thing. The odds are, in the other video, I talked about my soldier, John Timms. That's not that common of a name. But when I put his name in, there's a couple, like a dozen or more men in the Civil War named John Timms. So it's not uncommon at all.
Do you think like newspapers and obituaries are high on your list of, one of the first places you go?
It could be. I don't always go there first, but if I'm really trying to figure out, was this guy in the Civil War, it's definitely on my list of resources to check, yeah.
So earlier you had mentioned pension records, and we know that there's, pension record index cards just to kind of get us started. But what makes the full pension file so valuable?
Well, there's a lot of really interesting documents in those pension files. A lot of people are surprised when I tell them the average size of a Union soldier's Civil War pension file is about 100 pages long, all about your soldier. I've had people tell me I don't really need to know if my soldier was receiving pension benefits. No, you don't get it. There's a huge file at the National Archives all about him that has some really interesting documents in there. It could be telling about his family members, his service in the war, and maybe information about his widow or his children, affidavits from fellow soldiers, neighbors, friends, testifying to various things. It's a goldmine when it comes to genealogy.
It sounds like it's worth the effort to go find those records if you've confirmed that you have a soldier. Or maybe even if you're not sure, you could pull the records and find out if the wife is the same person, I guess.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Those records will probably answer the question for you. Is this my soldier? I'm always careful to guarantee anything that's going to be in the files. But I would say it's pretty likely that if you got the pension file and you weren't sure if it's your soldier, once you read through it, there's probably going to be some direct evidence or at least some clues that'll point you in the right direction to tell you if this was your soldier or not.
Draft registration cards is something that you had talked about before. And honestly, when I think of draft registration cards, I'm thinking World War I and World War II. I'm not, Civil War really wasn't on my radar for draft registration cards. So what's the biggest myth you think people might have about them?
Yeah, well, they're actually draft registration ledgers, as opposed to World War II and World War I, where you get the individual cards for each soldier. For the Civil War, what you're going to see is a ledger with a couple dozen names on each page. The biggest misconception is that if you find your soldier on that draft registration list, that means that they were in the Civil War. It's a huge misconception, and I deal with that. People contact me almost on a weekly basis with, I found my soldier on the draft registration list. I can't find him anywhere else. Well, there's a good chance he wasn't even drafted. That list is just simply a list of men who were eligible to be drafted. It is not a list of men who were drafted.
Okay, same goes for World War I and World War II then.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about family trees, online trees. You mentioned that they can be useful for clues. How do we separate those those hints versus kind of bad research?
Right. Do your homework. Don't trust everything you see. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. Just because someone put it on their ancestry family tree does not mean it's true. The other side of that, though, is just because it's on an ancestry tree does not mean it's wrong. You don't know who was behind that ancestry tree when they created it. Are they a professional genealogist? Did they just start on this? But if you see your ancestor on someone's family tree and they mark that they're in the Civil War, do your homework, see if you can verify that. But there might not be a need to reinvent the wheel. Maybe they already figured it out. Use it as a starting point and move forward from there.
Do you think local historical societies or county history, those vanity books, do you think any of those are helpful in searching your...
I think so. Yeah. These books that you're talking about, it was very trendy in the late 1800s to publish these county histories, biographical sketches, history of each township. This was probably about 20 years after the Civil War ended. A lot of them had books or chapters about military history. And they would a lot of times list the names of all the soldiers from their county in the different regiments. So it's definitely helpful. If you've got a common name soldier, it might not be as helpful. But if you see your soldier listed in there, it's again, do your homework and verify it, but it's a good clue.
Let's talk about land records for a minute. Do land records or maybe homestead records contain any Civil War? I don't think the Civil War had land grants, did they, for service like they did in the Revolutionary War? Okay.
No. That's another misconception, is that people think that their Civil War soldier got a land grant. Not at the federal level, at least. They didn't. But the Homestead Act was passed during the Civil War, and it kind of took the place of maybe military bounty land in the sense that if you were a Union soldier, they didn't do this for Confederates, but if you were a Union soldier, instead of staying 5 years on your homestead land in order to be eligible to get it for free, you could deduct your time in the Union Army from that. So if you spent 3 years in the Union Army, you only have to spend 2 years on that land, then you got it for free. If that was the case, that homestead packet at the National Archives should have documentation about his Civil War service, verifying what regiment was he in, how long did he serve, those kind of things. So that's a very overlooked resource when it comes to Civil War research.
Is that something you pull very often?
Yeah.
Homestead records?
I get a lot of requests to get Homestead packets at the National Archives. Even if he's not a Civil War soldier, those are very valuable packets of information to pursue anyway.
Now, I would, maybe I don't know. Are there certain states or regions that work best for chasing the homestead records? Would that be in the Northeast or?
It's not like a 100% rule of thumb here, but most of it was west of the Mississippi. There were some southern states. There was a Southern Homestead Act that was passed. So you may find them in the southern states.
All right.
If I see someone moving out to Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, Oklahoma after the Civil War, one of my first thoughts is, I wonder if they were a homesteader. You're not going to find them in states that were originally colonies, like Pennsylvania and New York and Vermont. The federal government didn't have land to give away in those states. But in the largely unsettled areas west of the Mississippi, there was a lot of land available.
So those records are at the National Archives, not like the BLM Glow website?
Well, they're at both. And
Okay.
the original paperwork for homestead records are at the National Archives. If you go to the Bureau of Land Management or the GLOW, the General Land Office database online, you're going to find a scanned image on there. But that's the patent image. That's just verifying they settled the land, kind of like a land deed, but you're missing out on all the other paperwork that led up to that point. The application for the homestead, the verification of what did they do to their land, the testimony from their neighbors saying that I'm his neighbor, I know that he spent 5 years here. A lot of good information there.
Excellent. Well, now I know you said you had some examples you wanted to share.
Yeah.
Do you want to show us some of the ideas that you had?
Yeah, I have some tips here prepared of looking specifically at that Civil War pension index to help determine if this is your soldier. A lot of times there are clues that are hiding in plain sight on these pension cards that can really help you determine, is this your soldier? Going to go through some of the tips. Then I've got one bonus tip at the end of something that is not good evidence that people use a lot of times to get confused by. So we'll get to that as well.
Okay.
This is an example of a Civil War pension index card, though. This one I chose at random because I thought he had a cool name. Cicero Solomon, kind of a cool name there. This is telling me keyword index. This is telling me that this Cicero Solomon has a Civil War pension at the National Archives. This is only an index card, not the actual pension file. If you were to order this from the National Archives, you could use this and tell them that you need this file number. They'd be able to get it. The problem is when people go searching on sites like Ancestry or Fold3, they get results like this, especially when they're looking at a common name. Henry Miller, 1,651 results. It's a little overwhelming to know which one is mine. Well, there are some tips that can really help. The examples that I've chosen, I think all of them, if not all of them, are fairly common names. But we're going to show you some tips that could help you figure this out. The first tip, and if you forget anything else that we talk about here, this is the one biggest tip I want you to pay attention to. You need to look on both sites, Ancestry and Fold3, because there are two versions of the same pension index card on these sites. Ancestry has this version, Eugene Alexander, in a Vermont regiment. How do you know this is your Eugene Alexander, though? There's not a whole lot of information on here. If you go over to Fold3, down at the bottom of this card, they have a good clue on here. He died January 13th, 1903 in New York, New York. That's a huge piece of information that can help you know if this is the right soldier. So make sure you're looking at both because you may be able to get new clues.
I see that the application number is the same on both cards too.
Yes, that's the one thing you need to do is to verify you have the same soldier. Check the file numbers to make sure they line up.
And for those at home who see that invalid versus invalid.
Yes, yeah.
It's invalid. Okay, excellent tip.
Okay, so here's the other one is you want to pay attention to who was filing for the pension, who applied for the pension. You mentioned the invalid pensions. A lot of times, it's going to be the soldier himself. If it's an invalid pension, that was the soldier himself applying. Nobody else could file that except for the soldier. After the soldier died, though, there were people that could be eligible. Henry Rhodes, fairly common name. If you found this in the index, there's a big clue here. His widow, Deborah, filed for this pension. If your Henry Rhodes was married to Deborah, there's a good chance this could be your soldier. If he was married to someone named Mary, this is probably not your soldier. This one is James Jackson, but his father was applying for this one. So we got the big clue that his father was named Samuel. But to be fair, there's probably more than one James Jackson with a father named Samuel. Do you know what the clue on this could be, though? Is that the people that were filing for this pension, for the most part, had to be the next of kin. So because it's a father applying, this tells me that James Jackson was not married. If he had a wife or children, they would be the ones that were filing, not his father. So this man probably was unmarried, and that's why his father was applying.
I have a question.
Sure.
So looking at this card, for example, it says the state in which he filed was Indiana.
Yeah.
If you've got somebody in a certain county in Indiana, is there a way to figure out which regiment he would likely have joined because of where he lived geographically?
Possibly. It's not an exact science, though. You can be familiar with which regiments were the soldiers from this county more likely to join, but that doesn't mean that they did join that regiment.
Okay.
It's maybe indirect evidence. It could be a clue, but you can't rule it in or rule it out based on that.
Okay.
In this case, Philip Kelly, a good Irish name here. Lots of Philip Kellys in the Civil War. The clue on here is it's a widow and a minor both applying for this pension. So we get the clue that Philip Kelly was married to Evelyn. But there's another clue on here that actually confuses people sometimes. It says minor, and I think that's an N, E.N. Wagner. You might look at this and think, he didn't have a child last name Wagner. I don't know who this is. Do you see that notation after E.N.
Yeah,
Wagner?
I think it's guardian.
Guardian, that's right. People get a little bit confused by that and overlook the fact that that's referring to a guardian. And just side note, that does not say grandson, which I've had people ask me about. They get confused and say, he didn't have a grandchild with that name. That stands for guardian. This was an adult male that was applying on behalf of the minor. So don't let that throw you off. It's not necessarily the name of the child.
Wait a minute, I'm confused. So E.N. Wagner is or is not the child of this soldier?
That would be the guardian of the child that was applying. So we have the
You
name
would think
of
they would have crossed off minor then.
Well, it was
Kind of.
a minor's pension that was being granted to that guardian on behalf of the child.
So then
And
Evelyn Kelly is the child? No, it's in
Evelyn
the...
Kelly would be the widow.
Okay.
The child is not listed on this pension index card, but the name of the guardian is. So the guardian can be a confusing concept for some people. That does not mean that the child was living with that man. You know, the reality is, in that time period, legally
Yes.
speaking, they needed a male to act on their behalf. Just because it was a mother did not make her eligible. They needed a male to handle the estate, what was being inherited. Maybe they inherited land as a 6-year-old. 6-year-old is not going to own land, but this male guardian could handle that until he becomes of age.
So
It does
both
not
of these
mean-
names here are adults.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm only pointing this out because this can throw you off when you're looking at the name of the minor and you realize, I don't recognize that name. Well, that's true. You might not. This probably isn't even a family member. It's an adult male that was handling the pension payments on behalf of the child.
Thank you for that.
All right. Yeah, so the other clue would be pay attention to when the pension is being filed. Over on the left side, there are some dates for this. For James Rogers, in addition to the big clue that he had a widow named Melinda, we see that he filed for an invalid pension in August of 1883. So let me state the obvious here. In order to file for a pension, you have to be alive. So James Rogers was alive on August 10th, 1883. If your James Rogers died in 1872, this is not your soldier.
Gotcha.
This could be a big clue in itself right here. The other clue would be the widow's date, February 23rd, 1910. Most widows filed for widow's pensions shortly after the soldier died. So I'm guessing that James Rogers probably died late January, early February of 1910, which could be another clue to help you know, is this my soldier? So here's another one. Samuel Armstrong. His widow applied for this pension in July of 1865. That's right as the war was ending. That tells me that Samuel probably died in the war or shortly after. If you have a family story that your great-great-great-grandfather, Samuel, died in the war, this is a good clue that this could be the right soldier here. It's not 100%. You still need to look at the actual file, but this could be him right here.
Do you recall if this is a Fold 3 card or if this is an Ancestry card?
Yes, this is one that came from Fold 3. That's why it looks a little bit different.
Okay.
Here's another one, John Franklin. He filed for an invalid pension in March of 1863, right in the middle of the war. So what conclusion do you think you could draw from this filing date?
He was injured.
Yeah, he probably left the war with a pretty serious injury. If you have a family story that your ancestor lost an arm or a leg or something along those lines, it's pretty good evidence that this could be your soldier because he's filing during the war.
My first instinct would be to go look for that. I'm going to guess that's Company K or something, Iowa Infantry. I'd go look and go look at the timeline for that regiment and see what happened. Was there a battle about that time?
True. Yeah, that's a good thought. Yeah, to see if that lines up. Where was he injured? My guess is the pension file and or the service records at the National Archives is going to give you more detail about what the injury was, how and where he was injured, that kind of thing.
Good point.
There's an exception to this, though, that can throw you off, and I need to point this out. There was a pension law that was passed in 1890 that made a lot of soldiers eligible for pensions who were not eligible previously. They relaxed a lot of the pension laws. So Henry Kinsey here, his widow applied for a pension December of 1890. That 1890 date, maybe even 1891, should be a red flag. She may have applied for this because she became eligible under that new law. Henry may have died in 1880. So when I mentioned that you can use that as an indirect evidence of a death date, 1890 is the year you want to look for. That's not necessarily his death date. That's the date of that law that was passed.
Good point.
Yeah.
Good point.
So before I give you this next clue, I want to show you the card first. Do you see a clue on here that could help you determine, is this the correct James Jackson? We already talked about the filing date. He's in an Ohio infantry, but there's another clue on here that may help you determine if this is the correct James Jackson.
The state in which he filed?
There you go. Yes.
The only other thing I see on there.
Yeah. James Jackson served in an Ohio infantry, but he filed for his pension while he was living in Iowa. If you know that your James Jackson moved to Iowa and was living there in 1890, this might be him. That's a piece of indirect evidence that could help you determine if this is the right soldier. That's a very often overlooked clue on these cards. Some of these clues are staring you right in the face, but could be easily overlooked.
Good.
So pay attention to where they were living. Here's another good clue. Was there an alias on the pension card? Here's an example. Benjamin Johnson had an alias of Benjamin Belt. Now, aliases, we're not able to tell from this card why the alias was being used. The pension file itself usually has an explanation. Pension Bureau wants to know, why did you have two names? Are you really the same person? So there's usually an explanation in there.
I wonder if maybe in this case it might have been a young person who was adopted by a second husband with a different last name?
There's all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah.
But here's one. You can find aliases across the board in all the different regiments, but I see them more often in the U.S. Colored Troop regiments.
Oh.
And this is a U.S. Colored Troop soldier. See where it says USC Infantry, U.S. Colored Infantry.
Okay.
A very common reason for an alias among the U.S. Colored Troops is that soldiers, while they were in slavery, had one name. Once they were freed, they chose a different name. So Benjamin Johnson may be the name he chose later in life. Benjamin Belt, he may have had association with the Belt family. The enslaving family may have been the Belt family. If you're looking for your Benjamin Johnson and you know that he possibly could have been enslaved by the Belt family, this could be him.
Wow. Interesting. Now, do you do a lot of research? I don't think you do, but I'm going to ask. Do you do much research with the Confederate side, and are the cards roughly the same?
You know what? I didn't point this out, and I should have. If you find a card like this is strictly for the Union side.
Okay.
The Confederate records, they don't have cards like this.
Okay.
Do I do
That's
a lot
good
of
to know.
Confederate research? No, because those records are not at the National Archives. A lot of the Confederate pensions are at the state archives. Confederate service records are online. So I don't have access to the records. I would work with them if I could, but I just don't have access to those records.
Okay.
Now, here are some small details. These other ones that I showed you were things that were staring you right in the face. There are some small details that are hidden on these pension cards that are very easily overlooked. That could be a good clue. Here's an example right here. There are a couple clues that are tiny clues that you may be overlooking. And the same clue is on here twice. This is kind of like one of those activity sheets when you were a kid, like hidden pictures of, do you see the hidden clue on this card? I'll give you a couple seconds and then I'll enlarge the part that I'm looking at that tells me the clue. Do you happen to see anything, Connie?
I see HC, which is popping out at me, but I don't know what that is.
You got it. Yes, you got it.
Is
there
that
you go. It is. Where it says minor, there is the letters HC. It's also down at the bottom, HC. It's very easily overlooked. And even if you see it, you might think, I don't even know what that means. That stands for helpless child.
Oh, wow.
So what this means is that the minor, Hattie Badger, had some kind of mental or physical disability that made them unable to support themselves even as an adult.
Oh,
The
wow.
minors, in most cases, once you reach 16, you were kicked off the pension rolls. In these cases, a lot of times you were eligible to stay on much longer, even into adulthood, if not the rest of your life. So a couple interesting things about this. Well, if you've got a family story that you have a great-great-great aunt that had some kind of disability, there you go. This could be the clue that you're looking for to know that could be true. If you see this, a lot of times these had to be approved by Congress, and there could be additional paperwork at the National Archives associated with Hattie Badger getting this helpless child pension. So there could be more paperwork available for this soldier.
I don't know how you learn all this stuff.
How do I learn all of it?
Yeah.
Well, from working with them. I've seen...
The HC part, I would have been, baffled.
Yeah, it's very easily overlooked as just a stray comment. Fun fact, the last Civil War pensioner died, I think, in 2020 during COVID because she was a helpless child. Her name was Irene Triplett. She was a daughter born to a very old soldier. He was very late in life when he had her. She had, I think, some kind of mental disability, and I think she lived in a home throughout her life, but she lived a long life herself and was receiving a Civil War pension up to the year 2020 because of this Helpless Child Act. It
Wow.
kind of blows your mind to think 6 years ago, there was a last Civil War pensioner being paid.
Can you believe that? Wow.
Yeah. Kind of crazy, isn't it?
That is a
Yeah.
fun fact.
Yeah. Here's another one, another small detail. If you're looking for John Wilson to know, that your John Wilson was from Iowa, there's another clue on this card that very easily overlooked.
I see an S.
There you go. You're smart. Look at that. By the invalid, that's the big letter S. Do you have any idea what that S could stand for?
No.
That stands for Spanish-American War.
Oh, interesting.
Very overlooked detail is this Civil War pension index, even though it's labeled Civil War, has Spanish-American War pensions in it too. And so this is the notation on Ancestry. That little tiny S tells me this is a Spanish-American War soldier. Spanish-American War was fought in 1898, more than 30 years after the Civil War ended. If you're looking for your Civil War soldier, John Wilson from Iowa, this is probably not him. This was 30 years after the war is when he was in the military. So look for that tiny little S as well.
Good stuff.
This one is a little bit more noticeable, but these are really fun when you find these. Okay, you're probably trained now to look. You may see it. There are two women's names at the top there. I'm enlarging it there. Phoebe Pierce and Lucy Pierce. Phoebe was the widow. Lucy Pierce was the contested widow. So Lucy came forward in 1901 and said, I'm the rightful widow, after Phoebe applied in 1900. There were two women that came forward. These are always so fun to read through. You get all the gossip, all the dirt about the divorce that was never finalized, or the women trying to verify that I am the legal widow. And you get some really fun stories in there. So
Wow.
if you have some family story about that he was married twice or had a marriage that wasn't really even an official marriage, maybe there's the evidence right there. What's interesting is, if you look, Phoebe applied for this in 1900. She's got an application number, 722349. Certificate number is blank. She was not approved. But Lucy, the contested widow, her column is filled in. She's the one that was approved for the widow's pension. So I don't know what the story was, but that would be a good file to look up.
Wow. Can you imagine digging that dirt up? That would be fun.
I know. Those could be really large files as well. A lot of investigation. It's unfortunate for the family when they have to deal with all that. But today, you hit the jackpot when you find those.
Nice.
One more reason to check on both sites, Ancestry and Fold 3. Let's say you're looking for Frank King, and you're looking on Ancestry and you can't find anything on here that verifies that this is your soldier. Over on Fold 3, that same card has a notation at the bottom that says C, that's IC, Invalid Certificate, 653434, Daniel, what's the last name there? Daniel
Mayhew.
Mayhew. So what this means in most cases, these two pension files are combined into one packet. And usually, not always, the usual reason is that both of these men were married to the same woman at different points. And so they probably had the same widow, where maybe Daniel died and she remarried Frank King. In those cases, they usually combine those pensions into one file. So if you're not sure if this is your Frank King, but you know that his wife also was married to someone named Daniel, this could be your soldier right here.
Now, in this situation, are both guys Civil War soldiers?
Yes. Yep. They were both Civil War soldiers. They both received pensions, and they would usually combine them into the same packet.
Gosh, does that mean she was double dipping?
Not necessarily, no. It doesn't necessarily mean anything scandalous. I mean, maybe there was, who knows? But usually it just means that she was widowed at one point and then remarried to the other guy.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Great examples.
When you go through all that, if you're still not sure if you have the right soldier, you may have to look at the actual records themselves to verify what you have. Let's say you're looking at James Jackson and you're looking at this and you think this could be him. I know he was married to Mary, but I don't know if this is my soldier. You may have to order the actual records to see this. For example, the pension files at the National Archives. If you ordered that pension file, there could be information in there that would verify this is your soldier. Now, every pension file is different. It's not unusual to find information in there about the name of the children and their birth dates that could help you verify. Not unusual to find marriage certificates in these files. In this case, we have the soldier, I'm a pensioner and I was born on June 3rd, 1845. So he's giving his birth date. Maybe that's the information you need to know if it's your soldier. In this case, it was a widow applying. Soldier's name was Samuel Boone, and she said that she was married under the name of Caroline Owens, her maiden name, in 1854 in Jacksonville, Randolph County, Missouri. Some really good genealogical information. If this is your soldier, you could probably verify it from these documents here. This is why these pension files are so valuable. They have some amazing stories and genealogical information in there. But if you don't want to make the big investment and order the entire pension file, there could be a workaround. The service records are usually a much smaller record. For the union side, those service records a lot of times have a card in there with biographical information. Joseph Moore, another common name. He was 21 years old when he enlisted. He was born in Orange County, Indiana. He was a farmer before he enlisted. That might be enough right there to help you know that this is not my 35-year-old Joseph Moore. This was 21-year-old Joseph Moore. So that's a much smaller investment and you might be able to get your information there. Good news is, though, some of these service records are already online. These are the states down here for the Union side that have their service records online. If your soldier falls in that state, you can look on Fold 3 to get those. You were looking at James Jackson. His service records online show that he was 30 years old, that he was born in Kenton County, Kentucky, and there's enough biographical information there, you may be able to figure out if this is the right James Jackson. Here's the bonus tip, the one record that trips people up all the time. So don't make this mistake. If you do make this mistake, I don't blame you because this is a very confusing record. People look at records like this. This is on Fold 3, and this is part of the pension index. So let's say that you were looking for John Rogers, and you find his name at the bottom of this card. It could be very confusing because it looks like he's listed as a dependent of Silas Nelson. He's not. What this is, none of these soldiers are connected in any way. They didn't know each other. They're not dependent on each other. The key is this number up here, 178345. That's the pension number. George Palmer, William Brannon, Silas Nelson, John Rogers. George Palmer has the number 178345. William Brannon has that same number on his pension card. Silas Nelson, there's that same number. John Rogers, there's that same number again. All this means is those four men had the same pension number at some point on their card. It does not mean that they were related to each other. They didn't know each other. They didn't serve together. All they have in common is the random assignment of that number. So if you're looking at that, I always tell people I almost wish they didn't digitize these because they can be more confusing than they're worth. Don't let this throw you off, though, because that's not real evidence that this is your soldier.
Good.
So that's all I have for that.
All right. So if you had one piece of advice that you want to give somebody who's searching their Civil War ancestor, what would that be?
I think one big piece of advice that I would give someone who just found out they have a Civil War soldier is keep an open mind. There may be records out there that you don't have or don't even know about. Maybe this whole concept of the Civil War pension file is new for you. You need to pursue getting that pension file. Most soldiers, if they didn't have a pension, most soldiers at least had service records that you could pursue. There's probably a lot of information out there about your soldier in various places, the National Archives, maybe online, but look into getting those records. There are stories out there that have been hidden for decades that could just be waiting to be uncovered.
So if somebody feels like they're stuck, they kind of hit a brick wall, kind of what's the best way to break through that Civil War brick wall?
Well, can you define brick wall?
Well, if they're stuck again, they're not sure. I guess we're going to have to correlate evidence. is where I'm going in my head, is that we're going to have to use multiple pieces of evidence in order to confirm the record and maybe, as you suggested, pull the records and see which one's yours.
In a lot of ways, Civil War research is not very different than just general genealogical research. You find a man with your ancestor's name in the records, correlate the evidence, piece it together. Was he old enough to be in the war? Did he live long enough? Does the pension card match up? All those pieces of information that you would do if you found your ancestor's name in the census records. Same thing.
Yeah, and part of me wants to go look at the rest of the family unit too. Is the wife a widow at a certain time so it couldn't have been? You just kind of have to look at everybody and the whole family unit and kind of correlate the people and the evidence.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fun. Wow, you are always a wealth of knowledge. So if people want to find you, where do they find you?
You can go to my website, civilwarrecords.com, and you can look at the various resources that are on there. There's links on there to the various pension indexes. If you want to see if your soldier is in there, you can go to the Get Started tab, and it's got a list of all the different wars that we work with, the various records that we can access, the links to the indexes, all that stuff.
On your website, civilwarrecords.com, you have some free resources there. How do they find those?
Yeah, if you go on there, there's also a tab that says free stuff.
Okay.
Click on there. There's a downloadable PDF. It's a free guide to researching your military ancestors. The various wars. Yeah, the various wars with the links to how to find them in the indexes, what kind of records could potentially be available. We didn't really talk about bounty land for the other wars, but it kind of explains the bounty land in there for 1812 soldiers, those kind of things. All that stuff is in there. You can download that, use the links, and be familiar with what kind of records might be available.
So I want to think that you used to say, I don't know if you're still using that tagline, that you go to the National Archives so the others don't have to.
Yeah. We go to DC so you don't have to. So
There you go.
we make the trip to the National Archives. We fight the traffic. We order the records for you. We can help get them in your hands.
You are so much fun to talk to. I learn so much every time I talk to you.
Well, good. I appreciate the invitation.
I appreciate you. So we'll catch everyone in the next episode. Thanks, Brian, so much for being here. And we'll see you next time.